Hi, everybody. Welcome to Palm Sunday, or an approximation thereof. I decided to go out for a walk and get some fresh air since I think I didn't leave the house for 2 days. And neighbor started up with a chainsaw. So I've come out to the woods and I found this beautiful vernal pool full of tadpoles or salamanders or some shy little amphibious creatures that all jumped in the pool and swam away as I approached. So, what an odd way to enter into Holy Week. As I was talking about just briefly on the video with the readings, we're missing out on the hosannas and the waving of palms. And yet the story remains. Right now I'm reading a book by Martine Prechtel, who's an indigenous thinker, philosopher, writer, storyteller. And in this book, which is called The Disobedience of the Daughter of the Sun, he talks about the Mayan way of telling and hearing stories. And there's this whole custom that he learned in which after the family compound has had their steam bath, then it's storytelling time. And so they gather around the fire and the storyteller begins a story. But the thing is with these Mayan stories, they don't ever really have beginnings and they never really end. The idea is that everybody falls asleep listening to the stories so that the stories just kind of continue. And what he says the lesson in that is that none of these stories are ever done. They're living stories. And in their repetition, in their telling over and over and over again, we find ourselves in our lives through these stories. And so that's what I'm sort of carrying with me as I'm thinking about this whole long, rich, heartbreaking passion narrative that we get in Matthew. And in Matthew's telling us just betrayal after betrayal after betrayal. And it's unbelievable. So, it starts, we start with Judas making his dirty deal with the chief priests who give him the 30 pieces of silver. And he goes to have the meal with the disciples. And he says to them, one of you is going to betray me. Because he knows. And they're all like, no, we won't. No, we won't. And he's like, yes, you will. And even Peter, of course, in his usual, but no, this will happen to everybody else, but not to me. And he says, before the cock crows 3 times, Peter, you're going to deny me. And after that, they must have been so shaken already, but they go off to the Garden of Gethsemane, where we sort of, in our own storytelling, we'll visit on Thursday. And he says to the disciples, can you just stay up with me? And he goes off and he prays to the Father and says, if this cannot happen, I'd like that, but your will be done. And he does this, several times. And each time he comes back and the disciples are asleep. And finally you can hear just the edge of pain and fear in his voice. And he says, could you not stay up with me 1 hour? The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. And that's, of course, where we get that saying. But then it goes on. And Judas shows up, betrays him with a kiss. This sign of closeness, this sign of deep friendship, that's the sign with which he betrays him. And then, of course, the guards take him and he goes after trial after trial. While the trials are going on, Peter goes ahead and denies him, makes all kinds of oaths, curses, and says, nope, never met the guy, don't know him. And of course, the cock crows and he feels terrible. But meanwhile, he's now been handed over to the authorities. Pontius Pilate can't find anything wrong with him, of course. But what does he do? Rather than being the just judge, rather than being, a keeper of order, he says, I wash my hands of this because I don't want y'all coming after me. And then, of course, there's the people themselves. And when they're offered a choice of the sort of sick and what is that even? The cynical benevolence of letting one of the condemned prisoners go, Jesus Barabbas, the notorious criminal, is chosen over Jesus of Nazareth, the innocent man. And even after Pilate's wife comes to Pilate and says, I had a terrible dream, don't have anything to do with this, he just lets it all happen. So we have betrayal on every possible level. We've got betrayal by friends in the most intimate of all gestures. We've got betrayal in just the sort of inability to stay with Jesus in his time of sorrow and fear and weeping and praying. And we have the sort of cool, distanced, cynical betrayal of knowing what's right and not caring enough to do the right thing anyway. In Martin Prechtel's explanation of this folktale that he tells, or the story that he tells from the Mayans, he says that the point of these stories and repeating these stories is not so much to tell a moral story. It's not a fable. It's not a morality tale in which the bad guys get what they deserve and the good guys, for having made good choices, get rewarded. Clearly, this is the opposite of that story, and that's very important. Rather, Prechtel says, you see a reflection of your own self, of your own society, of your own people in those stories. The stories reflect back what is true that can sometimes be hard to see in the moment. And so that's what I think about in terms of this narrative of the betrayals that Jesus managed to love through. When the crowd shout, crucify him, we in our congregational reading are asked to do that, not just because we need, to hear the sound of a crowd for the sake of production value. It's because we have to understand that lives in us. That a crowd can go from singing hosannas and waving palms to literal bloodthirst in a very short amount of time. I think in this extraordinarily strange time that we're in, we're going through a similar kind of reckoning. We're seeing sides of ourselves and sides of others that don't always come out when things are working okay and when people's sort of coping skills and coping mechanisms are working all right. We're seeing the parts of ourselves, maybe. I mean, I'm seeing it myself, my own sort of fear-driven behavior sometimes. That smaller, pettier, meaner, fearful side of ourselves. And you see it in the hoarding, right? We all know we need to share toilet paper, but it's happening anyway. So we see in the Passion story a whole lot of people at their worst. Maybe we can understand just how close to us that is when we're seeing our own behaviors and those of those around us sort of challenged or becoming more challenging because of the extraordinary strain we're under. One would imagine the disciples also, in their extraordinary strain, were not at their best. They knew trouble was on the horizon. Jesus had been making all of these allusions to dying and then rising again, but who could make sense of that? Then there's guards, and they're in trouble with the Roman authorities, and Peter, in his fear, starts saying, I never knew him. Nope, never saw the guy in my life. But his own accent gave him away. We need these stories because it's all too easy to tell ourselves fictionalized versions of who we are that flatter our egos. And that's the sort of stuff that leads us to squashing people who are weaker than us. Maybe we mean that on the very micro level in grocery stores, elbowing somebody else out of the way. But it also works at the level of nations. If we're taking supplies from other countries, who are we to do that when we've failed as a country to manage our own outbreak worse than it seems just about any other country? These are the sorts of things, these are sorts of questions, these are the sort of shadow sides that we all have to reckon with. And it's not even that by clinging to Jesus or by clinging to faith or by somehow, our own projects of moral perfection or whatever sorts of, perfection-based thinking, none of that is going to help us in this. None of that is actually the object of these stories or the object of the invitation that we have from God to keep on participating in this unfolding story. We know what happens. We know resurrection comes. We know that we're offered through Christ another chance, a chance to be that, not just the nicer, more polite version of ourselves that we offer for public consumption in times when things are easier, but we're offered something deeper. Redemption, reconciliation, growth, transformation. We get to become new creatures in God. And it doesn't matter who we've betrayed, usually ourselves first. It doesn't matter what our shadow sides are. What matters is that God's not done with us. We get to participate in an unfolding story in which we are the characters. We are the actors. We're given stories to guide us through our own. So as we start to walk through the Passion story, now we've gotten sort of the overview for the week. Now we walk through everything that we've heard on Palm Sunday and then what comes after. What do you want your story to be? What do you think God's story for you is? Who do you think you might become? There's betrayal along the way. There's danger, there's fear, there's sorrow, there's grief, there's even death. But the story doesn't end. Neither does God. Neither in some way do our lives, even if we pass through death. So even as this pool actually will in a month or so dry up and the creatures will go skittering off to whatever their next less amphibious form is, it comes back. There's a deep underlying structure to this incredible creation that God has given us. And it includes stories, and it's made of stories. So as we enter into this holiest week of the year with such an intense story, so full of little moments of heartbreak and mind-bending compassion, see where your story comes alive in it. See how this story comes alive in you. Pray with it. Sit by a pool if you can find one. Because these are the places where that transformation begins to happen. Where the calm comes, where the promise of redemption begins to work itself out in tiny invisible ways that we know nothing about until over time somehow we've changed. So that's the invitation for today and this week. I continue to hold you all in my heart and my prayers, and I think of you all so often, and hope that you are staying safe. It's been just so wonderful to get notes from you all, and I look forward to responding to more of them. All blessings, all of God's peace be with you now and as we go through this week. So we'll be checking back in a few days. Until then, rest, eat well, take great, wonderful, healthy gulps of fresh spring air, and give thanks. See you soon.